He's all Bengals all the time. James Rapien, a belated happy Easter. Did the Easter Bunny come to your house yet? Had to, right?
Of course, absolutely. And maybe not as much candy or eggs as there will be next year when she can run around and do all of those things. But yeah, it was a fun Easter for sure.
Well, it's a very different Easter when they get into college and or late in high school. I can assure you that. The Easter Bunny was always in a very good mood in the younger days. Now, hit or miss when they get to be 20 and 18, brother. Let me tell you, hit or miss. All right, let's get right to it.
We'll slow time down, so hopefully
right, you got a lot of time.
That's right.
I mean, look, Zim Hude, we have him on the show all the time. You know who he is. He does have, some personal relationships with some players. You do too. I mean, the whole 9 yards. Is there any reason to believe the Bengals have already signed T. Higgins to a long-term contract?
Well, signed as in pen to paper, there's zero chance.
Okay.
And I'm not dismissing Zim.
No, I know you're not. I know.
When that part happens, they will announce it and they'll throw the parade on social media because they should, right? That said, I don't think Zim is just making things up. I've known Zim for a long time before probably most of his followers know him as Zim Hude. And so, yeah, I mean, it's probably coming from somewhere. I haven't heard that, right? And so who knows? Now, have they agreed or are they close to agreeing? It sounded like he thinks that that it's done. I think were the words he tweeted. So if it's done, what an Easter present for the Bengals and Bengals fans. And I haven't heard anything, so credit to Zim if that's the case. But, it's certainly a priority for the Bengals to extend T. Higgins. And so if they were able to get it done and negotiate a deal with David Mulligetta, his agent, who also represents Jesse Bates, and we know how that went, then I think this would be a huge win for the franchise, huge win for T and the Bengals.
And, I mean, I think it's safe to say, the guy, I don't. I think it's fair to say that Higgins wants to be here. Well, let's start with that. You agree with that?
Agreed.
Okay. Well, I only bring that up because I think it speaks volumes to his unselfishness. And I think it speaks volumes really about the whole cast of characters they have down there from the quarterback to Chase to Higgins to the entire offense, and really Zach Taylor and everybody else that, and Brian Billick has been on this show saying many, many, many times, he was there when that Minnesota team had Randy Moss and Chris Carter and Jake Reed and Robert Smith. And you have to have guys who are on board with not feeling like they have to be the guy, because Higgins knows there will be games where he's the guy, but Chase will have games where he's the guy. But everybody seems to be okay with it.
Yeah, I think that's the balance. And so if you're the Bengals, you need to be able to, in this contract, make Higgins feel like the guy, even though there are going to be games where he's going to take a back seat. And who knows what happens in the draft. That might even go farther if they take a first-round tight end, right? Or if they take one of these explosive running backs where T. Higgins is still a huge part of what you're doing. But there are games where he's not catching 8 passes and getting 12 targets or 14 targets. And he's smart because all of these guys, they're like-minded in the sense that it's team first, and they came up in winning programs and cultures. And so they want to win, and they're not me. Even though receivers in general, that's the stigma that comes with them. I don't think that these guys are. Of course they have an ego and they think they're the best, which is why the contract better treat him that way, right? Whatever the contract ends up being, he needs to feel like the man. At the same time, I know he is a team first player. And that's another reason why, if you're the Bengals, you would want to invest in T. Higgins, is because I don't think he's going to be disruptive after his deal. I don't think the money would change him. I don't think any of those things would happen. And so he's a homegrown talent. You brought him in. He came into the league, was really good. He's gotten better and better each year. Why not invest in a guy like that? I think it's a no-brainer.
Okay. Let's shift gears here now to Mixon. I'm sure you've been talking about this ad nauseum, okay? Let me start by saying, and again, I'm going to ask if you agree or disagree. I think it also can be said, the same thing holds true for Mixon, of what we just talked about with Higgins. I think he likes it here. I think he wants to stay here. I think he is a team-first guy and has proven that in the locker room. during his entire tenure here with the team. Agree or disagree?
Agreed.
Okay. All right. So we agree on that. But
Yeah, agree on
now
that.
things get a little more complicated. Okay?
Yes.
I'm throwing out the thing besides just, who are you hanging with? What are they doing at your house? What's going on with hangers on, if there is that kind of thing, whether they be family or friends. The thing at his house in Anderson Township, I'm throwing out the window because he wasn't there. At the end of the day, he wasn't part of it. Okay, fine. And maybe you can't throw it out. I don't know. But now all of a sudden, this situation that occurred with the gun and the woman, they said all along, they being the police, that we're going to keep this open to the possibility of charges could come later. Well, now they're here. At the end of the day, where do you think, as we sit here this morning, where do you think the Bengals brass sits on their thinking with Mixon?
Whew. Well, I think that his days of making double-digit millions as a member of the Cincinnati Bengals are numbered. Now, it doesn't mean his days as a Bengal are numbered. I think there's a path where maybe they get the draft falls to them and they don't get one of these top running backs or their top targets. Day 1, day 2 guys, right? And you're talking 4th, 5th, 6th round now, and they only get one running back. Well, I could see the scenario where the Bengals are like, all right, let's get him to take somewhat of a pay cut, bring him back. He can still be valuable. And he is. He can be valuable, and he's still a productive player. But you mentioned the Anderson Township incident, obviously what happened on January 21st in the alleged incident, now charges refiled. It's two things. Regardless, Joe Mixon has been in the news for the wrong reasons this offseason.
Yeah.
The front office does not like that. The organization doesn't like that. Regardless if it's hangers on, regardless of what it is. It's easy to say that because I know it's true. You can't look at that stuff and smile if you're Duke Tobin or Mike Brown or the Blackburns or whoever you want to talk about. So to me, if he's not willing to take a pay cut, it's hard for me to envision. And it's not like you can just renegotiate his deal or you can renegotiate it. You can't restructure it. It's just the way it's structured. It doesn't make sense. So if he's not willing to essentially tear up the old contract and take a new one and essentially take a pay cut, I don't really see the path to him returning. And I think that's the position he's in, whether it is the off the field, not necessarily concerns, because you're right. He's been so good off the field since they drafted him. And so I don't know if they're necessarily concerned that he's going to get in trouble all the time, but being in the news for the wrong reasons, the value of the position versus what you're paying versus what you're getting, the clear examples now of the coaching staff not trusting him in big games to give him the most snaps. The fact that they wanted Samaje Perine back. I think all of those things point to either pay cut or eventual release after the draft. And I expect the Bengals to seriously prioritize running back as early as 28, as early as that first round pick. It certainly could be in play in the draft later this month.
Well, by that comment, you've almost answered the next question I had for you, which we debated on this program on Off the Bench last week, where I continue to ask James the question, a very simple question. Are the Bengals better today than they were at the end of last season? Now, they've addressed the offensive line with Orlando Brown Jr. I mean, no debate about that. Okay, but then you start getting into different areas. And let's focus here for a second on the running back position. I claim, now Mixon's still on the roster, but if for some reason he ends up not being on the roster, okay, you've all of a sudden gone from having Perine and Mixon, veterans, valuable, solid guys, to having basically nobody who's had any playing time whatsoever, including a potential 28th pick in the draft if you move on for Mixon. Do you think his season last year was more a result of a bad offensive line or his skills are declining?
I think it's a mixture of both, but Joe Mixon's always had a bad offensive line. The Bengals offensive line has stunk or been just bad or slightly below average, if you want to look at last year before they dealt with those injuries, or average, because I think they got to an average level at times last year. But at the start of the season, right, they were bad and they were figuring it out. He's played through that and been able to be productive and flashed. And the days of, man, they just don't use him enough in the passing game. And Mixon's just, he doesn't have enough holes to run through, and he has to cut the moment he gets handed the ball. I remember saying all of those things. I don't feel like that was the case last year. And he had what I thought was his worst year as a runner. Now, as a pass catcher, he was exactly what the Bengals needed. He was a check down, reliable option for Joe Burrow, and he's been able to build that chemistry. He's still a good player. And that's the part of it. It's not like he's awful and dropped off a cliff and can't play anymore. But the production is tailing off. It isn't elite production anymore. And when you look at him versus what his replacements could cost and give you, I think it's easy to see a scenario where you could fill that void. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting dilemma for the Bengals, and I get the experience part of it, but I also think that there are veterans out there that you could bring in to ease that pain a bit if you're worried about not having a veteran presence in that running back room. And we're getting closer to June 1. So they could wait until after the draft and do a June 1, a post June 1 cut for Mixon and save over $10 million against the cap. It would take a little bit of a hit next year, but that would free up a lot of money for Higgins' extension, Burrow's extension, Logan Wilson's potential extension. Heck, they could roll that money over and use it next year. There's a lot of different ways they could use it. And so that's why I think a pay cut, if he's going to be on the roster, is inevitable, because this front office, I just see them asking that. Or maybe not. Maybe they do that post June 1 and move on after the draft if they're able to land a replacement.
All right, but it would seem to me, James, and you tell me if you see it the same way. It would seem to me, if I were the Bengals and I were running the Bengals and knowing you've got the draft coming up here in about a week and a half, right? It seems to me that you would be having conversations already with Mixon, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't, I don't know. But I'd be having conversations with his agent before I get to this draft to say, hey, look, we're not going to pay you $10 million this year. We're willing to make that, how about, a 2-year deal for $5 million a year, build in some incentives, whatever it might be, right? And then that you have a guy who's been a very good, sometimes great player for this team that's on your roster, and you don't have to go in the first or second round for a running back. You can address other needs that the team has. Do you think that might be what's going on, or potentially what could go on before the draft with Mixon?
It could. It's just the problem with this is, and I don't blame Joe, I would feel the same way. Your employer comes to you and says, hey, take a pay cut. Well, that's a tough ask for anybody. And you mentioned it. He's set to make around $10 million this year. So you want to divide that over the next 2 years? He probably would say no.
Okay.
And so what's the middle ground here? Is it an incentive-based deal where it's $6 million and he can reach, if he hits his incentives, he can get to that $10 million mark and make up the money, the difference, and it just saves them on the cap end because they're hard to get incentives, essentially, or just kind of those incentives don't necessarily count against the cap. Anyway, without getting into the weeds there, I don't know. I think that they're going to wait until after the draft to do that. And the blueprint, and I kept bringing it up, and I've brought this up a lot this offseason, it's Andy Dalton. The whole world knew Joe Burrow was going to be the first pick, and the Bengals still waited and kept Andy Dalton on the roster, and then they released him and saved $17 million in cap or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's how they're viewing it here. But once you go down the road of pay cut, I don't think you can return. I don't think you can say, all right, Joe, take a pay cut. We're not paying you this. Oh, fine. We'll pay you this anyway. So I think they want that replacement in place. Maybe that's a veteran free agent as well and a back. Maybe it's 2 backs in the draft. And it doesn't have to be a back at 28. I think this is a deep running back class. And even if Joe Mixon was on the roster, you would want to address it in this draft because there are a lot of guys that can do what Mixon didn't do last year. Explosive runs, break tackles at the second level, and really open up the offense a bit. So I think regardless, they'll draft at least one. Do they want to keep Mixon on the roster or not? I think they know whether or not they're going to ask him to take a pay cut or if they're going to move on. But I'm not sure we're going to have that answer until after the draft.
All right, last two things I want to ask you about. Where do you think this whole Jonah Williams thing ends up? I mean, there are multiple scenarios here, right? He comes back to the team. He agrees to move to right tackle. He decides he's not going to move to right tackle. I guess theoretically he could sit out. Number 3 option, you trade him. What do you think?
Whew. This is as draft dependent as more so than Mixon, honestly, because I can find there are still veterans out there where you could get and rely on them to be a decent running back this year. There aren't veterans like Jonah Williams that you could just go out and get to play left tackle in my eyes. I think he would be the best available left tackle. But does a team want to trade for a left tackle that's undersized, coming off of his worst year, and guaranteed $12.6 million? And that's the part of this. He's guaranteed that money. It's not just, the cap hit and he's making less, or you can renegotiate, or you could extend him. And based on his age, it would make sense if he was coming off of a career best year. But I just don't think he has a ton of value. So if he doesn't have a ton of value, the Bengals likely view him or value him more than the rest of the league because they view him as their starting right tackle today. I know they said there's going to be a competition. That sounds good. I think Jonah Williams would win that, assuming he's healthy. So they view him as their starting right tackle. After pick 28, if Darnell Wright happens to fall, I don't think he will. But the kid out of Tennessee, I think he's a plug-and-play right tackle.
Yep.
I think the value then changes. If I know a lot of people say DeJuan Jones, I'm not even sure he's in play at 28. But if he falls to 60 because he didn't test, and he has a similar profile to Orlando Brown Jr., by the way, who went in round 3, could you take him at 60 and feel comfortable starting him at right tackle? Maybe. So I think there are some options. Anton Harrison would be another one out of Oklahoma at 28. But if you don't get a tackle in the first round or two, I think that's it. I think the Bengals will go with Jonah. They're not going to look at some of the veteran options in free agency and say, we trust them more because they're flawed. There's a reason they're still available. Jonah, does he have his flaws? Absolutely. But they know him. They knew they were paying him this money going into the season, and they've already allotted for that. And so I think he will start at right tackle if they don't take one early in the draft. I would say we have our answer by Friday, by end of round 2. Maybe you could go round 3. I just don't think that there's a starting level plug and play type offensive tackle that they would be that comfortable with in round 3. So I think after the first 2 rounds, we're going to know how they feel about Jonah Williams.
End of day, last question. If you were a betting man, and I know it's subject to change based on just some of these topics we've talked about, end of the day, the Bengals with 28 draft not a person, but they draft a what position, in your opinion?
Ooh, yeah, it's interesting because I think everything's pretty much still available, and it has to be at 28, within reason. Tight end, offensive line, defensive line, corner. Running back if Bijan's there. I think Jahmyr Gibbs, by the way, is a sneaky sleeper, maybe a trade down candidate. Maybe they love him enough for 28. It's interesting. I think I've hit on all of the positions. Does Kalijah Kancey fall to 28? Or does the NFL fall in love with him and he move up? I think he would be the pick if he was there at 28, the defensive tackle from Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Some of these cornerbacks could certainly be it. If I had to guess, I would still lean defense just in general because I think that's more likely to fall. I think Dalton Kincaid could be the pick, by the way. Everyone's talking about Meyer, who's certainly in the running too. I think Dalton Kincaid could be the pick. But will they make it there? Will Kincaid make it to 28? Will Michael Mayer make it to 28? I don't think Darnell Washington is in the mix at 28. Maybe he is. Doesn't feel like it for me. So I would lean defense just based on how the board falls. But offense is certainly in play depending on who is available and who gets taken in the first 27 picks.
All right, James Rapien, you can check him out, Locked On Bengals, his daily podcast, along with all of his articles. Great stuff at Sports Illustrated. James, thank you for your time today, my friend. We much appreciate it.
Of course. Appreciate you.
All right, James Rapien. Good stuff there. Good conversation there.